how would you pay for it? It's one of those questions that well-being economy change makers hear the most. And I'm so pleased to be joined here today by Milena Büchs, Professor of Sustainable Welfare at the University of Leeds, to help us further unpack this question. Now, Milena's research focuses on sustainable welfare, eco-social policy, just transitions, and climate justice. She's published widely on the relationship between economic growth and welfare states and the question of how welfare states can be transformed so that everyone's needs can be met within planetary boundaries. We're so grateful to have you here with us today, Milena. Milena will be presenting for about 25 minutes, and after that we'll have time for questions and for more of an open conversation. Now, given that today is a slightly more technical topic, just a very friendly reminder that there is really no such thing as stupid questions. So please always feel free to join in the conversation with your questions and reflections. And we'd love to help address those. We simply ask for questions to be asked in constructive ways. And because there are quite a few of us here with us today, to be mindful of the time we're taking when asking questions to allow for other people to come in with their questions as well. So with that, I'd love to hand over to you, Milena, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Margit, for this lovely introduction, and of course also for the invitation today, and to all of you for coming. It's a great pleasure to talk about this topic, which I have been working on and thinking about for a little while. I share my screen and my slides, so I hope you can see those. Just trying to make them big. Can you give me a thumbs up whether they are visible?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Perfect. Excellent. So I put my co-author's name on the slide as well, because we have worked on this together. I will say a bit more about this in a moment. But to go straight in, so the starting point for today's talk is really that the mainstream discourse, of course, suggests that growth is needed to fund government spending and also to improve people's well-being and finance the zero carbon transition, because without growth, tax revenues fall and public debt increases. And so, yeah, there's this sort of inherent growth dependency, I guess, that is often talked about in relation to the welfare state in particular, but also the economy more widely. So the post-growth perspective obviously challenges this view, or at least parts of this view. And I don't go into detail here. I don't hopefully need to, because I'm sure that people in this particular forum are quite familiar with all these arguments. But these post-growth arguments, in summary, say that growth really is problematic from various perspectives, for ecological reasons, because there isn't really sufficient evidence so far that we can decouple environmental impacts from growth in absolute terms and at the speed required to stay within planetary boundaries. And also because growth doesn't really sort of significantly improve well-being outcomes anymore in rich countries, and can even contribute to some social disbenefits like rising inequality. Another important point, I think, in this discussion is that many richer countries in particular already experience secular stagnation. So this is a term for essentially quite low growth rates already, which come from more structural reasons. So things like aging societies or the nature of technological innovations that we see now and how they compare to the types of technological innovations that we had in earlier phases of economic development. Of course, how AI and robotics and so on will impact on this is still an open question, but certainly growth rates have been relatively low in many OECD countries, for example, for a while. And so I think that is an argument to say we simply need to find new ways of dealing with that new context. So this is why this question is really quite interesting, this question that we are discussing today. So how can well-being economies and especially welfare systems be financed without growth? I will present a few funding options that the literature has been discussing, and then assess these funding options, especially from the perspective of growth independence, and then draw some conclusions from that in terms of what does that mean for how we should design well-being economies. So this is based on a paper which has just come out actually end of last week. And like I said, this is a collaborative work with my former doctoral student, Nicholas Langridge, from the University of Bath. He has actually graduated now, which is nice. But yeah, it was very much a sort of collaborative work. So what we've done there is we reviewed the literature on post-growth and macroeconomics, so ecological macroeconomics in particular, in terms of what sort of funding options do they actually discuss in the post-growth context, covering around 90 publications. And the funding options that popped up again and again, so we are fairly confident that we didn't miss sort of any major options in the literature. But I should say, obviously, we are restricted to the, in that work, to the options that are sort of in the peer-reviewed literature, let's say. And so there may be other options that are maybe discussed more in the grey literature, which we don't necessarily cover here. But in any case, the key proposals in the literature include, first of all, progressive income taxes, where progressive means that a higher tax rate applies to higher incomes. And income here is broadly defined, so it can be income from employment, profits and capital gains, but also interest from savings, for example. Then the second big proposal are progressive wealth taxes. Again, where progressive means that higher tax rates apply to people with more assets. And so there are various design options for wealth taxes as well. There can be a tax on overall net wealth, so basically excluding any debt that you have. But there can also be taxes on specific types of assets, like financial assets, land and property, inheritance and gifts, business wealth, etc. And that will become relevant in a moment when we talk about the growth independence of different types of taxes. Then the third big group of funding options is a big bunch of essentially sort of consumption-related taxes, but that includes environmental taxes because essentially they function quite similarly to consumption taxes. That includes things like carbon taxes, energy taxes, but VAT, excise duties, etc., would all fall into that category as well as some specific taxes on maybe luxuries like frequent flyer levies, for example, or other sort of air travel taxes. Another proposal in the literature is to redirect subsidies, redirect government funds, essentially. So this isn't strictly speaking a funding source because, we have already got the revenue for this. In this case, it is more about a decision to reallocate existing government resources from one thing to something else. And in this case, to reallocate subsidies from, let's say, fossil fuel production or high carbon industries to more environmentally and socially beneficial activities. And then finally, there's this big topic of money creation through direct government spending. So basically everything that is discussed under this banner of modern monetary theory, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, but it is quite a complex sort of topic. In the paper, we sort of try to break this down and try to make it simple, but essentially saying what modern monetary theory argues is that governments that have sovereignty over their monetary system, so unfortunately, that doesn't include EU member states. But countries like the UK or the US, for example, they don't need to tax or borrow from financial markets before they spend, because the act of spending creates money. So it's basically the central bank credits the government with new money. and hence spends money into the economy. So what modern monetary theory does is basically just reverse this sort of order between taxation and spending. It basically says, you can spend before you tax. Then taxation remains really important. It's not the case that modern monetary says, taxation, we don't need to worry about taxation, or it doesn't play a role anymore. Quite the reverse. Taxation plays an enormously important role because for dealing with inflation, because it takes money back out of the economy and can be used to essentially repay the central bank and hence sort of eliminate the money that it has created. And of course, also taxation is meant to disincentivize certain types of behaviors and incentivize other behaviors. So it's still important for sort of steering the economy. And of course, it has redistributive functions as well. And so these functions also remain really important. So in the paper, we then have 4 different criteria to assess these different funding options from a post-growth stroke sustainable welfare perspective. In this talk here, in the interest of time, I focus on the first one, on this question, how independent from growth are these different types of funding sources? We then also in the paper look at how redistributive are they? Do they support people's need satisfaction? And do they support the reduction of ecological harm? And I will just summarize the results on these other issues. So in the paper, we have this big table where we have all the different funding options on the left-hand side, and then the different criteria in the columns. I should say that in the paper, we also talk a little bit about local complementary currencies, but also in the interest of time, I've left this out of this presentation because they are not really that relevant, especially not for sort of central government and welfare state funding. So we then color code this table. And yes, and unfortunately, you can see that in this first column on growth dependence, we have a lot of red, and yes, red here means that we do have an issue here. And the different shades of red try to indicate something about the strength of the coupling between growth and these funding sources. But essentially, we conclude that none of these funding sources on their own are, strictly speaking, independent from growth. So starting with taxes, what we see there is that changes in the size of the economy directly or indirectly lead to changes in the volume of tax revenues and therefore also in the size of subsidies. So it's relevant for that point on subsidy redirection as well. So we do have, and it just makes sense, I think, we do have there a relationship between, the size of the economy and the size of revenues. And it would be disingenuous to claim that this link doesn't exist. But there are different maybe extents to which these different types of taxes are coupled to economic growth. So most directly coupled are taxes on income, consumption and production, and environmental taxes, because they are sort of taxes on, you could maybe say, flows, so on activities that naturally expand when the economy expands and that shrink when the economy shrinks. And most directly coupled are really taxes and social insurance contributions that relate to employment. So employment has a specific role in all of this because it is even more growth dependent than just consumption and production. And that is because of something that economists tend to call the productivity trap. So this is basically the idea that if we have labor productivity increases, and if we have even just low levels of growth or zero growth, then we will need growth. So in that scenario, we would already see an increase in unemployment, even without sort of negative growth rates. And that's because if labor productivity increases, we need fewer people to produce the same amount of output, right? And so that makes employment extremely vulnerable at the moment to this sort of growth dependency, or it is one of the key drivers of growth dependency. That's maybe something to highlight here. So, and I will come briefly back to that as well when we talk about some of the solutions. When we look at some other types of taxes, they are a bit more indirectly coupled. So, for example, wealth taxes, they tend to tax the value of assets, right? And so then the question becomes, how much do the values of assets, so let's say property prices, for example, or stock prices, how much do they fluctuate with economic growth? And we have actually started some empirical work on this as well, because there isn't actually that much on this question yet. Sort of, are they less directly coupled to economic growth compared to income taxes, for example? And what we think we see already is that the coupling is a little bit less direct, but there is still some coupling. So property prices, for example, they do tend to increase when the economy expands, and they tend to drop when the economy shrinks. So we would still have some coupling there. The only exception is that if we did tax the physical size of assets, that could be quite independent from growth. So, if we just have a tax per square meter of land or property, for example, that would obviously not be affected by changes in the size of the economy. And some countries, especially in the global south, actually have such taxes in place. But there are not many countries really that have these types of taxes. And there are some drawbacks here as well. You could argue that it's a bit unfair to have the same tax rate for a property in inner city London compared to a rural place somewhere in Scotland or Wales. And then, you could maybe try to design a system where you still tax the square meterage, but you have maybe differentiated tax rates, by region, and sort of taking the values of the property somehow into account, but still trying to decouple it from changes of the value, essentially. But that would obviously make for a more complex system. And there's a drawback with that approach as well. In the long term, it would be, I think, not possible to hold these types of tax rates stable in a shrinking economy, because people would need to find the cash somewhere to pay for these taxes, so that could be a challenge as well. Okay, then on to this second big sort of funding source, which is money creation by direct government spending. So yes, the act of government spending itself is independent from growth, and I think this is why we colored it a little bit lighter red. But the problem or issue with this approach is that it could lead to inflation, especially in a post-growth context. So here it's really important to bear in mind that modern monetary theory was not initially a theory designed for post-growth. I think it was actually, it's certainly a sort of, it's maybe not designed, it's maybe the wrong word, but it's certainly trying to argue that it can be beneficial for growth, because the idea is often that there's sort of unused capacity in the economy, and that we are simply lacking private investment. And so if the government steps in and makes these investments, that can basically mobilize this unused capacity in the economy. And that could be, people who don't have work at the moment, or unused factory capacity, and so on. But the problem is, of course, in a post-growth context, the idea would be that governments have already implemented certain regulations that help the economy to stay within planetary boundaries. So these would be things like emission caps, or caps on certain types of resource users like fertilizer and so on, or limitations on deforestation, etc., etc. So if the economy is already at that capacity, then there isn't, that unused capacity in the economy that could just expand economic activity without creating inflation. So in other words, if we are already at capacity and the government is spending more money into the economy, then there's sort of too much demand for labor and resources compared to a possible supply, and that would likely increase inflation. So the literature here says, well, okay, yes, that is an issue, but we could also try to deal with inflation in various ways. What we are particularly concerned about is inflation of necessities, so prices of necessities, because that would hit especially low-income groups. And so if we are able to, for example, implement price controls for necessities, or provide universal basic services so that necessities are available at low prices or even for free for certain basics, that could already help with that. And of course, taxation itself, as I explained earlier, that also helps more generally with inflation because it takes money out of circulation again. And so this is that means we try to make this important point that actually one needs to look at these funding sources in combination as well. It's not enough to just look at them in isolation. We can also sort of think about some sort of financing packages in some ways. So especially how would, for example, direct government spending interact with taxation? And then the next big question is, to what extent is it actually a problem that these funding sources are, at least to some extent, coupled to growth? And I will hopefully provide some more positive answers about this in a moment, before making a little diversion and talk about the other criteria that we had to assess these different funding options. As you can see here, there is much more green when it comes to redistribution, need satisfaction, and also the reduction of ecological harms. So most of these funding sources have sort of positive, or at least the potential for positive outcomes in relation to these criteria. The most and only problematic one is really consumption taxes and environmental taxes on necessities, because we know that these are distributionally regressive, which means that low-income households bear a higher burden of these taxes relative to income. And that can also then undermine the need satisfaction of these groups. So these are the only sort of problematic ones, and there could also be measures to counterbalance these regressive effects, for example, by redistributing some of the revenue to compensate for these regressive effects, or to use them directly, again, to support things like public transport, for example, or renewable energy, to make these essentials more affordable for people. So that is just summarized on this slide here. So let's go back to this question then, about to what extent is it a problem that funding sources are, at least to some extent, coupled to growth? And here, so I came to that question really from a welfare state perspective, I have to say. And so, yeah, it might be interesting to discuss how applicable is that to the well-being economy as a whole. But what I've been thinking here is that basically the problem really mainly only exists if we have a shortfall between the demand for spending and the supply of funding. So let's say if demand for spending increases because of population aging or rising unemployment or climate change impacts, and the supply of funding stays the same or falls, then we have a shortfall. Or if the demand for spending, even if it stays the same, but the supply of funding falls, for example, because the economy contracts, then that also creates a shortfall. So what we would be after is a sort of situation where the demand for spending and the supply for funding are more in balance. I should very briefly say that I'm conscious that we use this language here of supply and demand, and that is obviously very reminiscent of, neoclassical economics, where we have a nice market and the price mechanism regulates supply and demand. I just want to clarify that this is really not what we mean here. So supply and demand are much more complex sort of phenomena here that are determined by a bunch of different things, certainly not just a price on the market. So just to clarify that. And so that means, however, that we can look, when we look at sort of how can we finance a well-being economy without growth, I think it's important to look at these two levers in some way. So we can look at the provision of funding and how we can stabilize the provision of funding. The key thing here, I think, is to stabilize employment in economies without growth, because, like I said, that's sort of one of the main drivers of growth dependence at the moment. And that brings us to talk about the role of productivity. So if we had an economy where we don't have big increases in labor productivity, then that could take a lot of pressure off to have constant economic growth just to keep employment levels stable. And people like Tim Jackson and Peter Victor, Simon Mayer, and so on, they certainly support this sort of argument and say we could shift our economy more towards sectors where it's more difficult to increase labor productivity. So, for example, healthcare and social care, but also environmental conservation and things like that. Then, of course, there's this big discussion about working time reduction, which is one of the key proposed policies to redistribute work in a post-growth economy and make sure that there's more even participation in the labor market as well. Their job guarantee is mentioned quite often. I made a question mark here because obviously job guarantee would also cost money, so it has a repercussion on the demand for funding side of things. And then there's this interesting point, I think, about aging societies, where yes, on the one hand, aging societies increase the demand for funding because we need more pensions and more healthcare and so on. But at the same time, aging societies also tighten labor markets because the share of the working age population shrinks. And so that could also maybe actually stabilize employment in a post-growth context. Then just really quickly, because I'm conscious of time, but so it remains important to reduce the environmental impact of production and consumption, because that basically creates this room for taxable activity and you know, the sort of economic capacity in the of economic capacity generally that I've been talking about in relation to modern monetary theory as well. And then finally, the final point on this slide here is really that we need to keep in mind that in phases of shortfall, there are political options to deal with this. We can, of course, increase the tax base, and we can also increase tax rates. So it's not the case that, you know, we have no options here. But of course, these options are political decisions, and they can be quite difficult political decisions. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm just saying, you know, we shouldn't always say, we don't have any money. We you know, there could be means to deal with shortfalls in particular phases. And then, of course, we can look at the flip side of this, which is the demand for spending. So population aging here is obviously a very big topic. How can we deal with population aging in ways that you know, maintains the well-being of older people, but also manages the demand that comes from population aging? And so there are difficult questions here, I think, in terms of, you know, is it an option to extend working lives? I don't really have a good answer to that right now, but I'm just putting it on the table. It would reduce the demand for pensions. It would include older people in the labor market. But of course, it's likely to be quite unpopular. What about new models of intergenerational living and social care, where, you know, social care can be provided within households and also deal with things like the loneliness crisis and so on? But again, I'm conscious this is probably a proposal which doesn't fit very well with the sort of trends and social norms and expectations that we have seen over the last few years and decades even. Then there's this big topic of failure demand, which the Wellbeing economy actually has also promoted very much, and which I also very much support. So this is this idea that we have demand for government spending at the moment that comes from the fact that economies are not designed very well and are not satisfying people's needs very well. And so if we can manage to redesign economies in ways that more directly satisfy people's needs, then we would actually reduce that demand for avoidable funding. So having greater social equality, which reduces healthcare spending, having preventative approaches to healthcare, and then just really fundamentally reorganize the economy. So ideas from the foundational economy are quite important here, for example, to provide affordable housing, food, energy, transport, and so on, not just through government intervention, but also simply through how we organize the economy. And by that, I mean also more not-for-profit production and provisioning, and more collective, and yes, also some public provisioning as well. And I think that would involve new rules and valuation approaches for enterprises or corporations to really, rather than them just having profit maximization as the main aim, to incentivize them to actually contribute to social and ecological objectives. So that would be a very different, social and economic model, and a very different way of running the economy compared to now, of course. Just as a side note, of course, this whole debate about failure demand is not an argument against public spending. I think it's very, very sensible to have collective insurance systems for healthcare, pensions, and so on, social care as well. So it's really just an argument about the avoidable spending that we currently have because of failures of the economy. Yeah, and this is basically all I had time to say. So in 2 sentences, maybe a brief summary of the main points. I try to show that the funding sources for well-being economies and welfare without growth that the peer-reviewed literature discusses, none of these sources is strictly speaking independent from growth, and employment is one of the key drivers of growth dependence. But I think it would be wrong to draw the conclusion from that we can't finance well-being economies without growth. It really, what matters instead is to have sort of new perspectives on the economy as a whole. And that really means making employment less growth dependent, reducing failure demand, and very fundamentally reorganizing economies so that they provide need satisfaction more directly and cater social and ecological outcomes rather than profit maximization and growth. So yeah, I think this is where I will be leaving it. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, I have this little graph here, which is in the paper as well, which just illustrates this point that sort of need satisfaction will take up a larger share of the economy in a sustainable, steady state economy, essentially, compared to where we are now. And we also try to make the point there that public spending is not the only part there. The market still plays a role, but we need to very much reorganize the market and regulate it more to make sure that social and ecological objectives are being fulfilled. So yeah, this is where I will be leaving it. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Milena, for such a great presentation, and also for the work to look at the how can we finance well-being. I think it's a really good question to a lot of people are thinking about. So I would like to open the Q&A, and I see some hands already in between participants. Very good. I also saw a few questions in the chat, but maybe I kick off with my question, so take the opportunity to do that, and then go to the chat, and then Ben, I think it will be your turn. So my question is it's a really inspiring presentation and good research. My question is really, if the governments would like to make that change, where would they start? Could they start from something small?
Could they start from something small? Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I don't know. I'm afraid I think it does require, I think, a sort of, reprioritization as well. And that is something deeper than maybe just a small change in, I don't know, adopting a different indicator system or something like that. Although these two are obviously very, very closely related. So yeah, but I wonder, it's sort of, very basically, I think it's about a more holistic approach to policy making. And so from that perspective, I think, yeah, you would need to bring different departments together much more and sort of develop that holistic thinking to really try to have conversations about, okay, how can we ensure that we prioritize need satisfaction and environmental outcomes in all the policy making that we adopt. And that includes, our taxation and so fiscal and monetary policy and economic policy and so on. So yeah, so I think that's sort of one of the most fundamental ones. Yeah.
It
Maybe
sounds good. More collaboration and working beyond silos. That
Yes.
could be like a first step. That sounds really good. I think a lot of governments are trying to do that as well. I see Martin. Sorry, I see Martin asking a few questions in the chat. Do you mind taking the floor and choosing your favorite question and asking one, and then we go to the audience.
Yeah, I can try to formulate that. For me, I analyzing a long time the monetary system by self and looking about back or through the question of financing, because this is only a small question, because if you know how the money is created and for what, you see financing is not the real question. Financing is only a question of power, and the one that has the power give this question to say we don't interested in your steps, and on the alibi question that this is sozusagen financing would be missing, but this is not the truth. So I think there are more steps to say looking behind that, and I think the most important is for me leaving the employment alone and bring another way of income. So reform the monetary system, making another distribution of money, and then you don't have the question to stay in employment, because we have not the resources to give employment to everyone. Also, a job guarantee would not solve the resource problem, because if they do something, you need to kill the trees and kill the plants and something. So this is my bigger view then. Decouple income and employment.
Thank you for your input. Yeah. Yes, I think I'm aware that this is obviously it's one of the options that is discussed. So, things like universal basic income, I assume you mean here as well. Yeah. And yeah, I can see some arguments for that. I think it needs to be funded though, and then the question, then you get very quickly into the discussion, okay, what is more efficient? Is it more efficient to fund universal basic services or universal basic income, and what is the sort of balance between those? Yeah, just on this.
Genau, this is the point. If you look on the monetary system, you can throw the financial question away, because you change the monetary system that everyone get the money, and changing the rules in the monetary system. There is no financing, because financing is only the discussion who get it and who from what take it. Also only the state question on redistribution. But if you change the rules in the money system, you have no redistribution. You have only giving.
Yes, no, I do understand the logic. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, can we take one more question from the chat? Natalie asking, what about making money non-speculative so that money itself can't make money? It could change the incentive structure.
Yes, that is an interesting point, and I think you could argue that with more money creation through public spending, that would address that partly, right? Because that is partly the problem at the moment, that if we have a lot of money is currently created through debt as well, but through private money markets. And yes, and a lot of money is used for speculative purposes, and financial markets are obviously directly dealing with that, which takes a lot of resources away from actual need satisfaction. So yeah, I would say absolutely, that would be a key step to take. Yeah.
Thank you, Milena. Okay, we go to the floor. Ben, thank you for your patience. You can ask a question now.
Yeah, thanks, Milena. Really helpful. I guess my main question is, it seems that a lot of your options you looked at were about sort of redistribution, which seems to anchor it still in an extractive social democratic model. Whereas my understanding of what a wellbeing economy was about is really changing the productive capacity to make sure that it's circular, regenerative, and is meeting real needs, which is more about sort of pre-distribution. So I was wondering, did you also look at sort of policies that were about really tilting and incentivizing markets, and also incentivizing provision outside of markets, including things like commons as well? And so I just wondered, did you look at those as well as redistribution? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, and I think that the reason why we look at these sort of, very classical sort of fiscal policy measures, like taxation and so on, is really that we started from this question: how can you finance a welfare state without growth? And in the end, I think the examples that you give, they come in the second part, to then say, okay, yes, we have that coupling between all these different funding sources and growth, but what really matters is to reorganize the economy. And I think this is where the pre-distribution absolutely comes in. So I would say, unfortunately, maybe in this paper, we didn't have the space to go into much detail on this, but I would absolutely agree with you and emphasize that that is really where the action needs to be. So yeah, because that would reduce, for example, failure demand, as we've just been discussing. It is a very different way of organizing the economy so that we directly satisfy people's needs, essentially. And yes, commons and not-for-profit cooperatives and so on absolutely play a very important role there. So yes, I would say it could be really interesting to bring these two strands maybe together in future works in a bit more of a systematic way, to really sort of try and discuss how they relate to each other, which we haven't really had the time for or the space for really in this particular publication. So yeah,
Thanks.
I hope that helps.
Thanks, Milena. Next question. Just, did I pronounce your name correctly? Do you want to ask a question? Just?
Yes, it's Joost. It's a Dutch
Joost.
name, so it's very normal that it was hard to pronounce. Well, I have a question. Well, as being from the Netherlands, we are a country that, well, politics was discussed. We are a country of coalitions, so we need to build coalitions within our public, our government system. But to get the vote from the voter in public debate, it nowadays is all about imagery, because debates about taxes or redistribution, employment, it's too hard for the public debate too hard to have that well, on the television, the talk shows, social media. So what image would you suggest to that I could share, well, with my friends or with people who are a bit less less deep into the material? What would be the first image that comes to mind to you that you say, well, this is a very strong thing you could talk about?
Yes. Gosh, yeah, that is a very interesting question, and I am very interested in that myself, because we have been looking in another project at sort of existing, well-being economy initiatives and donor economics initiatives and so on, and try to see how do they actually communicate, for example, even to start with, and seeing that it is extremely difficult for some to actually openly even talk about, let's say, a criticism of growth, right? Because this is so entrenched, I think, and this is what everyone is expecting to hear, that policies should support growth and so on. So yeah, so it is very tricky in some ways. But I don't know, I think we would probably need to find sort of other ways and expand some of the existing ways of engaging with citizens in more deliberative ways, where we can explain these ideas in a little bit more detail and have more participatory processes as well, to sort of formulate collectively what we think our needs are, and how we could satisfy them in more ecologically sustainable and fairer ways, essentially. Also taking, you know, future generations into account, and people in the global south and so on. And so in all of this, to come back to your question about imagery, I do think it's quite important to use sort of positive imagery there, and sort of, you know, to ideally to combine obviously the ecological and the social dimensions there, to somehow communicate that what we are after, what this agenda is about, is really about inclusive, long-term well-being for planet and people. And so somehow, you know, having that in one image, that would be, yeah, powerful, I think.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And yeah, I think the main thing that sticks is, well, the positive. Well, as you can see, I'm outside, so while I might stroll back, I'll think about it.
Yeah, wonderful.
It's very nice
weather in the
where you are.
Netherlands. Right, thank you so much, Milena. Kelsey, Connor, please ask a question. I see you also asked a question in the chat, so maybe you can just ask it live as well.
Yes, thank you. So I had a couple of questions, and actually, Just's last question helped me maybe refine this a bit. I'm thinking that, so my question is, do you think that people are, let's say, too greedy? Let's say in the participatory process that you just described, people have to be willing to give up maybe what they have in order, especially the elites. And so you would also mention cultural change. Do you believe that that is possible? How do we go about doing that? And then somewhat related to this is the political viability. So people often move from one, or firms move from one place to another to take advantage of tax breaks. So I'm thinking political viability and culture all together. So do you have any hope for us?
Yeah. Yes, it's great questions. Thank you. Yeah, and I don't have really good answers, I'm afraid, probably. But what comes to mind first, I think, is I don't know, sort of based on my experience, it can help people to change their perspectives as they learn a bit more about the actual impacts that their actions or their lifestyles, current lifestyles, have, let's say, on the environment, but also on people, other people in the world, is, for example, the global south. And so, you know, I think making it more concrete what the consequences are of our current high carbon lifestyles for current generations, but then also sort of projecting that forward a bit, what could be the consequences for future generations, and somehow visualizing that a bit more. I think that could be quite powerful to make people maybe realize, you know, how big the change is needed, and to motivate change. But yeah, it is difficult, and I think it's especially difficult to ask individuals to change if they don't see that the environment around them isn't changing, right? So I think my suspicion is that people would be quite prepared to change if they are aware that everyone around them would do the same, right? If we're sitting in the same boat, then that's easier, but no one would be saying, oh yeah, I'm just happy to, I don't know, give up my flights when everyone around me is still flying around the world on holidays and so on. So this is, I think, partly the problem here. And yeah, you know, we need all types of interventions that we can think of. I think we need culture, we need that sort of level of engagement as well, through stories and films and music and art and so on, to engage people on that level. And then have the political conversations and so on, of course, as well, combined with hopefully more democratized ways of engaging with the economy. I think that is quite crucial, but we are at extremely early stages with this. I mean, you know, there are a bunch of cooperatives in the economy at the moment, and I'm a member of some, and I know myself, even now you get an email to vote, even just to vote for, you know, the committee there, and it's like even just finding the time to vote for the committee is really difficult. So how, you know, we would need very different lives, I think, to engage in more democratic decision making about our economies. And some of the things that we've been talking about, like universal basic income and universal basic services and so on, could help with that, actually, to free up some time as well for people to engage with these processes. So yeah, these are my very, very undercooked, sort of very immediate responses to your question.
It makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. I pick up another question from the chat, if that's okay. Nicholas was asking, what might be the path to get it implemented, and what are the current strategies to get the policies into power? So it's a really practical question. What works and what are the paths to implement it? I know you mentioned to my question, right, where to start first is from collaboration and from looking at different sectors at the same time. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a big topic, and you know, there are sort of various levers here, I think. So the getting out of political silos and so on, and have more collaboration across different departments is certainly one thing. But I think starting with good existing frameworks. So at various levels, you know, the wellbeing economy itself, and WEAll obviously promotes approaches for national governments, for example, to go about their budgeting processes in very different ways, and about policy planning in very different ways. So I think that is extremely valuable. And then at more local levels, the donor economics approach also has great advice, I think, on various levels of policy making. So, you know, from the indicators that we use to plan, but also to assess what we are currently doing, then how we plan policy making, and how we then implement policy making. So there are great frameworks out there already, and I think, yeah, if governments at various levels could engage more with these frameworks and see how they can apply them, basically. I don't think there's a sort of one size fits all approach. Of course, they all need to be adjusted to circumstances and context, right? And this is why it's so important for, really people, for policymakers to engage with these things, and then to see how that can be applied to their particular
experimenting,
context.
right? Trying
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Milena. I think we're out of time, right? Do we have more time for questions, Margaret?
No, I mean, this was always going to be a really big topic, of course, to be covering in 1 hour, but so appreciate, Milena, all of the insights that you've been sharing, and, you know, sort of pathways into thinking about this problem. And I've really loved and enjoyed in your paper how it brings together so many of the different aspects and elements that we're reading and learning about in this space, and how it really brings it together in one sort of overarching view. So yeah, can't thank you enough for joining us today. I see lots of appreciation from the room as well. And then, of course, all of you in the audience as well. Thank you for spending your time with us today, and to set aside 1 hour of your day to talk about finance, which I really appreciate as well. I hope it's offered some new inspiration for ways forward. Now, if you are a policymaker and you'd like to receive invites to these sessions directly into your inbox, then do sign up to the Global Wellbeing Economy Policymakers Network. And Laura has just been sharing the link to that in the chat. And if you're curious to further explore what a wellbeing economy approach can mean for government, as Milena has just been talking about as well, then I'd also really encourage you to check out our free online course on wellbeing economy policy design. There's actually a version for policymakers as well as one for a more general audience. And so Laura will be sharing that link in the chat as well to the course, and we'll soon be adding a new module on government finance, building on some of the amazing work that Milena has been doing, and she's very kindly been helping us with some of those modules. And then in relation to your point about business, there will also be another new module coming up about policies for wellbeing economy business, because that's of course also a very key part of this whole conversation. So do check that out as well. So with that, thank you so much for being here with us today. And we really look forward to seeing you back for our next session, which will take place on the 4th of June. And there we'll be diving deeper into Malaysia's Planetary Health Action Plan, which is promising to be another great session. So hoping to see you back then. So thank you so much. Thank you, Milena, for all of your insights. Thank you for everyone who joined being here with us. I'm very much looking forward to reconnecting soon.
Big pleasure. Thank you so much for all your questions as well.